history behind that term and story.
Great. Thank you so much for that generous introduction and generous question, and thanks as well to Boston Review, a very critical, I think, resource in these times, and thank you to Harvard Bookstore for hosting this event and hosting so many enlivening, enriching events in the area. I also just want to, in the spirit of Dr. Williams's comments about the economic boycott and the role capitalism plays in our lives, also offer just a gesture of support for the Harvard Bookstore Union, which is currently involved in a contract fight to secure living wages and fair wages for the people who make this bookstore what it is. I just wanted to offer my support and solidarity for that effort. Yeah, it's your question. I'll take it in a couple different places. So the project started as a question that I had about how global decolonization influenced the history of the United States. And that question felt particularly resonant when I started working on this project, which was really around 2015 and 2016, a moment of a kind of high watermark in some ways of that era of the Black Lives Matter movement, the post-Ferguson moment in that movement. And I was really struck, engaging with some of the work around that in the area and reading kind of statements that groups like the Movement for Black Lives was putting out around their policy platform, just how connected that sort of segment of the American left was to a kind of global analysis of some of the local conditions that they were protesting and fighting against in a moment when I felt like the broader American left, in somewhat of a different moment than it is in today, was largely overlooking some of those kind of internationalist orientations and questions. And so that, I think, motivated the project somewhat politically, and intellectually. I was really struck in reading, historiographies of American foreign relations, of the civil rights and Black Power movements, and of Black political thought, that decolonization as a kind of force, as a phenomenon in the mid-century, was treated by most historians of the United States either as a kind of arena for Cold War conflict, or a moment of transformation in the U.S.'s own territorial empire, in which the Philippines was granted independence and so on, or as a kind of goal that discrete groups of Americans were fighting for, right? Including, of course, a longer history of anti-colonial activism among African Americans. But what was lacking, I thought, from a lot of the work on that question in particular, was a sense of decolonization as a kind of force on the domestic landscape, and a sense that this global transformation was influencing the way Americans were perceiving their own supposedly domestic questions of racial inequality, class inequality, and so on. And so reading primary sources like Carmichael and Hamilton's Black Power, and reading just how often this terminology of internal colonization appeared in the political thought of especially that sort of 60s moment in the civil rights and Black Power movement, I thought this could be a kind of window into that question, right? Why is this analysis coming about and coming to the center of conversation when it is? It seems to demonstrate that, in fact, decolonization and the end of the kind of era of colonial empires abroad was providing a new vocabulary in American political thought. And so that was kind of where I began my investigation into what the book became. And I think the idea, you cited this idea of a keyword, and that's an important kind of concept for the book in general. I look at how the political vocabulary of certainly Black intellectuals and civil rights and Black Power activists, but also sort of elite Cold War liberal policymakers and social scientists and intellectuals, how they develop new ways of linking the global system of colonialism, the ongoing process of decolonization, and questions about American racial and class inequality.
Yeah. Thank you. Can you just give us a sense of the stakes of this kind of initial decolonization moment? I'm thinking, you start the book with 1945, World War II, the immediate aftermath of World War II, this question of what is going to happen to these empires that have been so fundamentally destabilized by the war. Can you just give us a sense of kind of the historical landscape and kind of what's at stake for Black intellectuals, as well as policymakers during this time, and how they're thinking about what the post-World War II world is actually going to look like?
Absolutely. I really look at the World War II moment as a moment of a tremendous conflagration that's also created a tremendous sense of possibility in reconfiguring the international order. And so the first chapter of the book, or the first two chapters, really look at conversations between foreign policymakers in the State Department, kind of elite philanthropists, and Black intellectuals and activists like W.E.B. Du Bois, Ralph Bunche, and Rayford Logan about what the post-war order would look like, particularly with a focus on Africa. Because there's a clear sense, because of the material devastation of Britain and France through the Second World War, as well as the kind of increasing ideological delegitimation of, in particular, the kinds of explicit racial hierarchies that undergirded the colonial system in World War II, created a sense that the system of empire was not long for this world, but it didn't create a sense of exactly what would replace it. Right. And for a lot of these African-American thinkers, they were very interested in reconceptualizing global governance as a means to try to reform the imperial context. And this was a really kind of surprising, actually, archival finding that I had, that even up into the 1940s, people like Du Bois, who had a very radical critique of what colonialism was and what it meant and what it did, were also invested in a kind of conservative understanding of the possibility of some kind of democratized system of global order, global trusteeship to kind of shape what the colonies would become. And that really starts to change in 1945 with the Manchester Pan-African Conference, which is the first Pan-African Congress that is really organized and driven by colonial subjects from Africa and the Caribbean rather than from African Americans themselves, where the mere idea of some kind of guardianship or trusteeship, no matter how internationalized or democratized, is thoroughly rejected. And I think that marks a shift for a lot of Black thinkers here in the United States, a shift in their sense of sort of where the vanguard was in Pan-Africanism. And it was also a moment, the Second World War, of thinking critically about how this global colonial order related to the racial inequality within the United States, and especially in the North, as we've kind of come to the high watermark in some ways of the Great Migration.
Yeah. So just to build on that, I mean, I think a lot of the work, a lot of the historiography looking at decolonization, Black political thought in the post-World War II period takes the Cold War as its framework. And I think one of the real contributions of your book is you certainly acknowledge the importance of the Cold War, but you kind of push us to move beyond thinking about the Cold War as kind of the normative framework for looking at particularly, this discourse around colonialism, decolonization, and eventually when we get to the terminology of the internal colony. I wonder if you could say a little bit about why it's necessary, why you felt it was necessary to kind of create a new conceptual framework for thinking about, again, Black thought, Black activism around decolonization beyond, certainly within, but also beyond the Cold War framework.
Absolutely. I think there's kind of two strands of the book that really try to get at this question most strongly. The first has to do with this idea of the kind of importance of decolonization in shaping Americans' political vocabularies. We're all pretty familiar with the ways that the Cold War sparked a bunch of kind of conceptual innovations, the idea of totalitarianism, for instance, or the reconceptualization of American capitalism as a free enterprise system to be counterposed to the kind of totalitarian Soviet enemy that many historians have kind of written about. And I was struck just sort of reading in those histories how little decolonization seemed to figure, and it seemed to me that concepts like the internal colony and ideas like the notion of the U.S. as the first new nation, which I write about, are also deserving of that kind of attention, and they speak to a different
say a little
context.
bit about this idea of the United States as the first new nation. I mean, that really struck me. It was like, United States is the first new nation? Like, what are we talking about?
Absolutely, and it gets to both the importance of the Cold War, but also the limitations of just seeing the period through the Cold War context. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, there was a very prominent discourse in the social sciences, in kind of liberal policymaking circles, and even in the Kennedy administration itself, including John F. Kennedy himself, that sought to frame the history of the United States as conversant with the newly decolonized nations in Asia and Africa, by saying that, in a context when the allegiance of these states was very much a concern, especially in the Kennedy administration in that period of the Cold War, to say the United States can provide certainly material aid to these countries, can provide military aid, but also what we can provide is a story. And what we can provide is a kind of ideological story that we, too, broke away from the British Empire, and that we were the first nation to break away from the British Empire. And this, of course, overlooked, the history of settler colonialism, most obviously, and of course, the history of transatlantic slavery in making the United States as exactly right. So, but it was a powerful kind of tool in the ideological arsenal of kind of New Frontier era, another metaphor that speaks to the history of settler colonialism. That it was a powerful kind of tool in that ideological arsenal, and it was explicitly contradicted and counteracted both globally by a conglomeration of Asian and African states who went to the United Nations in 1960 in their UN Declaration 1514 to say that the United Nations stands against colonialism in all its manifestations, and also contradicted by the developing discourse of in Black political thought of African Americans as an internal colony. And really what the kind of disagreement hinges on is what colonialism is about, right? For Kennedy and for the first new nation idea, colonialism is fundamentally about political sovereignty and political sovereignty alone. The only way you could make a claim that the United States is kind of not a kind of colonial power in various ways, but in fact the first post-colonial state is through that kind of understanding of what colonialism meant. And you can see in State Department writings at the time that the people talking about the kind of semantic problems around the idea of colonialism. This was a definition that had kind of live political potential to a lot of different segments of American society. And of course, for figures like Harold Cruse, who's kind of centrally important, the African American writer, cultural critic, he was centrally important to the development of the concept of domestic colonialism in the early 1960s. He looked at colonialism as a system of racialized economic exploitation and kind of cultural degradation that spoke to lots of different conditions than just political sovereignty. And that was kind of really where that disjuncture lay, and helped, I think, to form a kind of key point of ideological division between the developing Cold War liberalism on the one hand and the development of what would become sort of Black power political thought on the other.
So you use the word development quite a bit. You did it just
I
did. But I want to think about the role of development in the project, which I think is a central part of what you are interrogating, the history of development, the investment that the United States feels it needs to make in these newly decolonized nations, but also how that's conversant with the discourse that emerges around underdevelopment as well. You write, I think very poignant in the books that you're exploring the recursive and intertwined nature of domestic and foreign policy making. How does this kind of history of development in the 1960s become intertwined with the history of public policy centered around underdevelopment, particularly in Black urban communities. And I think this is really critical to how we think about our moment today, right? I mean, when we see, USAID, being fundamentally just completely dismantled, right? When we think about, the attacks, that are ongoing on what's left of Great Society, programs, focused on, urban underdevelopment and so forth. So, what if you could just kind of lay out that relationship between development, underdevelopment programs, and why understanding that history is so important for kind of how we think about our moment right now.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. Development is maybe a word I overuse, but also it is a topic I talk about in the book quite a lot, the history of international development in the kind of early years of the Cold War. And I see that as kind of a place where a lot of the analysis that gets developed of colonialism as a system of racialized economic exploitation during the years of World War II, the place where that goes in African American political life in the early years of the Cold War. So figures like Du Bois, figures like Rayford Logan, the Howard University historian and NAACP kind of foreign policy expert, they're very interested in kind of trying to shape American foreign aid policy in the era of the .4 program, to try to shape it along lines that are more generous in terms of quantity, but also kind of more targeted at labor and at workers in Africa in particular. And they're largely unsuccessful in kind of their efforts to shape that policy program, but it speaks to their investment in that idea of international development as a potential arena for, again, a more kind of radical understanding of colonialism to potentially play some kind of a role in American politics. And a lot of those ideas get translated as well into the investments of a lot of African American thinkers and activists into the decolonization of Ghana. And I spent some time in the book looking at Black activists and writers who either travel to Ghana or are briefly living there, who contribute to a lot of development debates in kind of Kwame Nkrumah's kind of government in the making. And a lot of those ideas about international development, both from a kind of state policy side, but also, I think, from the side of African American thinkers and activists, filter into debates surrounding what we might call underdevelopment at home in the 1960s, in the war on poverty era. It's now been very well established that a lot of war on poverty programs had their origin points, or at least had important precursors in projects that the United States was engaging in abroad. Community development programs abroad, filter into the community action program at home. Ideas about development that shaped the Peace Corps, which was run by Sergeant Shriver, then influenced the Office of Economic Opportunity that was run by Sergeant Shriver. And when that's happening, there's a lot of simultaneous emphasis on the role that, while they didn't use this language, the role that we might call racial capitalism played in underdeveloping Black America. To take Manning Marable's, famous, take part of the title of his famous book. And this question of development and underdevelopment becomes a really central piece of the story of the kind of concept of internal colonization and the broader story of how decolonization shaped, again, these sort of supposedly domestic debates about race and poverty at home. One of the kind of key figures in the book is the psychologist and community action leader Kenneth Clark, who's best known probably for the role of his and his wife Mamie's so-called doll studies in the Brown versus Board of Education case, but is also by the middle of the 1960s really fixated on the problems of poverty and racialized economic exploitation in the ghetto. And he's really focused on that specifically in Harlem, where he lives, where he works, where he develops his own kind of community action agency. And he's responding to a lot of work by philanthropists and by social policymakers that are themselves influenced by their understanding of decolonization, that are trying to come into this community and try to kind of empower and elevate what they call, as their terminology was, indigenous leaders, and their understanding of what made a kind of successful indigenous leader was very much shaped by their work in development projects overseas, as I show in the book. And that was really the idea of kind of providing resources and kind of material as well as political support to certain members of a community that might have a claim to representation within that community, but also have political views that are within a certain kind of boundary of moderation. And Clark kind of chafed against this in various ways in Harlem. Clark himself, not a particularly radical figure in the kind of constellation of mid-60s Black political thought in any way, but he develops a kind of colonial analysis of and
he's using that term.
And he's using exactly that term, right? Yeah. He's using very deliberately in his book Dark Ghetto in 1965, and before then in the 800-page social scientific study of Harlem that he bases the book on, develops this very influential formulation of ghettos as political, educational, and above all economic colonies. And much of what that book is devoted to is trying to analyze the forms of racialized economic exploitation that substantiate that analogy.
Right.
And I think that's a really important point where this idea of development and underdevelopment intersect with this developing understanding of internal colonization.
Yeah. I mean, but you also point to 1965 as being this moment, as you term it, of a crisis of vocabulary, right, in the Black freedom struggle. So this moment where there's a need to develop a different way of thinking about the challenges that Black America specifically is confronting, and the internal colony framework becomes especially resonant. It kind of takes off in a lot of ways. Can you talk about why that framework became so powerful? Why so many different Black thinkers, I mean, whether we're talking about Carmichael and Hamilton and others, kind of latched on to that idea? What were some of the broader kind of forces that gave the internal colony framework resonance? And how did it manifest itself in different ways? Certainly kind of in the arena of public policy, as you're talking about, but I think one of the things you talk about in the book is how it was much more expansive as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've been talking a lot about the kind of genealogy of this concept and kind of where it comes from, but by the mid-1960s that's really the moment when its kind of national purchase takes off, as you said. And I do think it has a lot to do with a kind of shifting phases in the long civil rights movement. And so, we've kind of moved away from an understanding of the civil rights and Black power movements as somehow opposed, but they were still distinct within the long Black freedom struggle. And I think part of what renders them distinct is indeed this, what I term the kind of crisis of vocabulary, and specifically it's a crisis of the vocabulary of second-class citizenship. I think that brings to bear this idea of reframing what American racial hierarchy really constituted. This idea of second-class citizenship, which is so prominent in the early 60s and earlier phases of the civil rights movement, is heavily criticized by Malcolm X, among others, for the way that it kind of promotes what some have called the creedal narrative of American history, that American society has as its kind of origin point the ideals of liberty and equality, and is constantly on the way towards their fulfillment. And Malcolm X said, the idea that African Americans are second-class citizens, or that second-class citizenship is kind of the best name for the forms of racial inequality in the society, that gives too much credence to that idea of the kind of creedal narrative. And in fact, what we should be thinking of is the way that these systems resemble a kind of colonization. And he articulates this in his famous Ballot or the Bullet speech, and across a number of different arenas. And I think that part of the reason why that moment was, a particularly receptive one to a kind of conceptual reframing of the Black freedom struggle was the successes and also disappointments following the Civil and Voting Rights Act. Right? So the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 seemed to bring about legislatively the form of first-class citizenship that people like Roy Wilkins were asking for, but didn't undercut the forms of economic exploitation, kind of cultural degradation, and these other forms that racial inequality took and takes in our society. And so a new language was needed. Right. And the language of internal colonization, which, again, has this longer genealogy that I trace in the book, but is also particularly resonant in a moment right after the kind of high watermark of global decolonization, and before some of the kind of disillusionment with that comes about a bit later, makes that analogy, I think, particularly attractive. Yeah. And it does get taken in a number of different directions, I should say. Like with its proliferation across the different realms of the Black freedom movement and Black intellectual life after 1965, you then have a variety of different versions of it. Yeah. And I think, Carmichael and Hamilton's book, Black Power, is this really interesting book because it has so many kind of tensions within it in terms of what they actually mean by internal colonization and what that actually entails and where you go from that analysis.
Yeah. Why don't we turn things over to questions from the audience? I had a couple more questions I was tempted to squeeze in, but I'll refrain myself. Yeah, we'll start over here.
Yeah, Sam, this is so exciting to see this book out. I'm a teacher, and I teach Black Power by Carmichael and Hamilton. And when I teach it, when we talk about the internal colony stuff, I teach it, my students always say the same thing, which is they say, the project is resolving second-class citizenship. It's kind of obvious what to do in first class. But if the diagnosis is internal colonization, it's kind of unclear how to resolve that, because African Americans don't spatially resemble Ghanaians, and it's not clear what national liberation would look like for a group that is a minority and kind of spread through the country. And that always made me wonder if this is an analogy that allows solidarity, or if it is an identity that really, these are colonies and other colonies.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question, and it really speaks to a lot of the complex debates that I get into in the book in the late '60s about what this analogy means. Are exactly about this question, right? It's exactly about the question of space and territory. And so, there are Black Power groups that try to think about national liberation in a very territorialized way. The Republic of New Africa, for instance, which I don't talk about too much in the book, but I've written an article about elsewhere. They say they have a version of the kind of internal colony thesis that goes back to the kind of Black Belt thesis of the 1920s and 1930s that says, well, what we need is to establish is a land base in the former Black Belt of the South, in which we can start to actually fight for true political sovereignty. That's one answer to the question that is brought up. It's not the kind of predominant one, though. That's a relatively small group in this constellation. And for the others, I think there is a real challenge of trying to think through, well, okay, if there isn't a kind of, specifically defined, national space, that doesn't necessarily mean that decolonization needs to take the form of nationalism as it did in so many of these colonies. And this kind of speaks to where we actually started our conversation, which is when decolonization was imagined in the colonial world, it wasn't always imagined in terms of the replication of the nation-state form over the territory defined by the colonial borders. So why should we expect it to necessarily look in the exact same way in terms of internal colonization? And that's what a lot of people like James Boggs, for instance, who is a kind of key figure in my book, the auto worker and Black Power writer and an activist in Detroit, he, in the kind of early to mid 60s, really tries to say, well, the city represents the kind of site of colonization in so many ways, right? The extraction of resources from poor Black communities within the city through labor and capital and consumer exploitation, combined with forms of residential segregation, create a kind of territorial specificity that might not lend itself to national political liberation, but does lend itself to a kind of colonial analysis of what's happening. And we might then kind of think expansively about how to undo those colonial relationships within a metropolis. And so that kind of speaks to the different ways that different thinkers are kind of resolving this question of space and scale.
Yeah. But it's not only spatial, it's also psychological as well. I mean, because you talk about the importance of the cultural nationalists and this idea of decolonizing the minds of Black folks, and that as a form of kind of decolonial liberation as well.
Absolutely, yes. So, I mean, another place that this discourse gets taken is exactly into those realms of culture and education, right? To say, and here, the English translation of the works of Frantz Fanon are particularly kind of influential, which take place very rapidly between 1963 and 1967 and become kind of key touchstones. So that idea of kind of decolonizing the psyche plays an important role as well. Yeah.
Any other questions? Don't be shy. Well, I have another question.
Okay. You take it.
You've name dropped a lot of really, really interesting people in this conversation. Is there someone in doing your research that you were just kind of confounded by, who really has kind of struck you and you really had to struggle with to try and make sense of, okay, what is this individual thinking? How do they fit into the book? So yeah, I'm kind of curious about some of the characters you encounter, if there's one in particular that really stands out.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, the book is kind of brimming with actors, and it's sort of not like biographically driven in any way, but there are so many fascinating people who make their appearances. I mean, I think everyone who reads a lot of Harold Crews gets kind of confounded at some point. He's so often seems driven by personal animus in some of his writings about other members, especially of the Black left, as a kind of former communist who leaves the Communist Party. He writes quite bitingly about figures like Lorraine Hansberry and others in his book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And it's hard sometimes to parse out like what is analysis and what is anger in some of those writings. And yet I think Crews has still a lot of interesting things to say. And so I really tried to spend a lot of, and he's such clearly a very key figure in the kind of conceptual genealogy of the idea of internal colonization, that I spent quite a lot of time trying to struggle with, okay, what really is his kind of, what ideas is he really kind of trying to put forth? And I think, he has a shift. Ultimately where I landed was that he has a kind of shift from the early 60s to the later 60s. And that in the early 60s, he's really kind of committed to developing this idea of domestic colonialism. And he sees it in as a means to kind of make international connections and to also kind of draw from international struggles for Black struggles within the United States. By the later 60s, he's still often kind of referring to that language, but is very sort of almost anti-internationalist in some ways, and very focused on kind of developing, especially the kind of his particular vision of a kind of material struggle over the organs of cultural production in the United States as a means of kind of internal decolonization. So he was a fairly confounding figure. Another character I really didn't know as much about when I started researching it and became really key figure in the story, and is, I think, an underappreciated and understudied figure in American history, is St. Clair Drake, who was a sociologist and anthropologist, and also an activist. His kind of organizing roots are in sort of Quaker peace activism in his milieu, where he grew up. And in the middle of the 1940s, he co-writes the book Black Metropolis with Horace Cayton, who's an older man and a more established figure. But as I found in the archives, Drake really wrote like 80% of the chapters in that book.
I didn't know
that. And that is a kind of a brilliant work of sort of urban sociology of Chicago in the war period. And it's a moment, again, of thinking about the structures that define life in Bronzeville in relation to the kind of global conflagration and the kind of cries for freedom in India and Africa and elsewhere. And he shows up in my story a whole bunch of times as an informal advisor to Kwame Nkrumah in the 1950s, as a mentor to the SNCC activist James Forman in the 1960s, and as someone kind of reflecting on the idea of internal colonization, kind of at the denouement of that concept's kind of political resonance in the 1970s. So I think he's someone that deserves a lot more attention. Yeah,
I appreciate that. Yeah, we got a couple hands. Yeah, sir, and then get you.
So, I know it's a mistake to ask in a story. I'm really interested about resonance of your work in the current moment, where you see flying, where you see possibilities, or hope, and how you're thinking about this.
Thank you for asking that
Yeah,
question,
thank
because
you.
I was going to ask it too.
Thank you.
The crisis of vocabulary, I think that's something that we're wrestling with right now in many ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think that, I mean, I see. Well, I'll answer this question in kind of two ways, right? In terms of what the work might say to our current moment, I hesitate to draw any kind of like direct lessons, but I do think one of the things that the book is very invested in is the idea of a political vocabulary that tries to link domestic inequalities and domestic forms of violence with the global system is really essential, and it's essential in this moment now, for certain. When we have a kind of increasingly militaristic posture of the United States abroad, when we have incredible crackdowns on speech and protest and dissent at home, those two things are obviously linked. They're very obviously linked when it comes to protests over Palestine. And that seems to be a place where a kind of vocabulary that would link the crackdowns of cops on people fighting for against genocide on American streets, and politicians of both parties calling for more resources to go to those cops, while also approving resources that are also going to the genocidal violence abroad, seems like you would want to make those connections. And that also in some ways like does speak to one place that I've seen a lot of hope, which is in that movement of anti-genocide and pro-Palestinian activism that has flourished on American streets and since over the last year and a half. And I think that draws on the kind of more recent history also of Black internationalism that I also see a lot of hope from over the course of the time horizon of the past decade or so, where I think the kind of leading edge in many ways of American engagements with some of these kind of international questions has come from a kind of youth-led, often women and queer-led Black movement in the United States. So I've seen a lot of hope in both of those places, for sure.
Yeah.
I had a very similar question. Where do you see
Great question. Yeah, I mean, my book is mostly focused on kind of questions of political economy and debates in that sphere. But as the conversation has already surfaced, right? It's ultimate in the final analysis impossible to divorce that from kind of questions of culture. I mean, as a historical matter, I think that you have in the late 60s and 1970s kind of increasing fragmentation of elements in the Black freedom movement around these kinds of questions, so like people focusing more on cultural nationalism versus more on kind of economic reorganization. And I think that split, and there's many instantiations of this, kind of most famously and violently the conflict between the Black Panthers and us in California. But more generally, I think that speaks to one of the kind of key forces I see in the kind of diminishing of the importance of the kind of language of internal colonization in the Black freedom movement. That kind of fragmentation and that kind of divide, I think, contributed a lot to that, for sure. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Want to squeeze one in? Well, I just want to wrap things up by reading from the end of Sam's book, where you write, colonial comparisons may not resonate in the same way they once did in the time of the world historical transformation of decolonization. But regimes of racialized economic exploitation still operate across multiple scales, ensnaring localities and nations alike in a web of indebtedness, undemocratic rule, and violence. Any effort to confront such conditions requires a political vocabulary that makes these connections clear, a politics that envisions the domestic in light of the international remains essential. And your book is indeed essential reading. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to Sam Klug and Chad Williams for speaking with us tonight. Huge thank you to Boston Review for co-sponsoring, and to all of you for coming out on this Friday night. Books are available for sale just at the registers, and they'll be signing here at this table. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you.